Good morning, church. It's my privilege to be able to stand before you as Frank asked me to speak this morning. It is very rare, as I know from 46 years of preaching, for a preacher to have a Sunday off. And Frank certainly deserves that, and I'm glad he's had that time to be with his family. We're thankful that our Antigua group has arrived. I received a text message just last Wednesday from Kevin Faust. You know, we've been praying, especially because the construction crew was going early. The roof trusses were there in the port, and Mark had mentioned that on Sunday. We need to be praying about that, and got a text from Kevin on Wednesday that that Wednesday morning the trusses had been delivered to the job site. We have a great God that answers our prayer on their behalf. I'm very cognizant of the fact that, and Frank is every week, of the time constraints that we have to preach, because we do have class coming up, and I'm thankful there's a clock on the wall. I'm reminded of the story every time I see Frank take his watch off and put it on the pulpit when he begins, of the member that had a visitor come with him to church. And of course the visitor was unfamiliar with things that go on in churches of Christ, and so every time something went on, when they started passing the plate, he said, "What does that mean?" And when they started the communion, "What does that mean?" And finally it was time for the preacher to get up. The preacher got up and got ready to start and lay his watch there, and the visitor would lean over to the member and says, "What does that mean?" The member said, "Unfortunately, it doesn't mean a thing." But there is a clock back there on the wall, so I'm very cognizant of that. I do have my watch. But you know, for the last number of years in full-time preaching, I've always tried to use our national holidays and the seasons as a backdrop to the sermons presented that day. And this weekend is no exception. We celebrate Independence Day, July 4th, 1776. Our declaration to be free from the tyranny of the British monarch King George I. We are a nation that was founded on religious principles and practices, and we were dependent upon God for our nation and for its progress. What a turnaround 239 years have brought in the historical profile of our nation. The UK is probably now our strongest ally, and we are now acting as independent and far away from God as our nation has ever been. But can that dependency be restored? I think that's the challenge for us as members of the body of Christ, and for us as Christians as we face this next decade. And while background material is important for every sermon, I believe especially in this lesson, some factual American history needs to be re-examined. It is true in light of historical revisionists that are claiming that America was never founded upon God or religion. But as Bobby Jindal, presidential candidate from Louisiana, announced last week, America did not create religious freedom. Religious freedom created America. That is why I want to spend a few minutes this morning examining architecturally, historically, and document-wise the information about our founding fathers. And I wish every school child in America could hear this information. If we begin our journey, and how many of you have ever visited Washington, D.C.? You've seen many of the things that are around there, and I just want to kind of give an overview of the things that are there. If we begin to look at some of the sites and some of the quotations and some of the inscriptions that are found around Washington, D.C. In 2009, Christian Broadcasting Network reporter set out to see how much Christian heritage is on display in our nation's capital. The reporter started at 17th and Constitution Avenue. And she said, quote, "Literally, within a few minutes' walk, so many references to God appears that the ACLU might have a fit." The first building she stopped at was the Daughters of American Revolution, in which George Washington presided over the first Continental Convention of 1787. And he opened it by saying these words: "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hands of God." Quote unquote. Another inscription that is quoted in the building itself is Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 28. "Remove not the ancient landmarks which thy fathers have set." Isn't that interesting? The Supreme Court building, and we've sort of heard from them in the last few weeks. The Ten Commandments are located in several places throughout the court building, inside and out. But particularly interesting is the frieze of Moses and the Ten Commandments that sits directly above the benches where the judges sit. It is as well on the oak door at the rear of the chamber, the gable apex, and it is in dozens of locations in bronze latticework surrounding the Supreme Court bar seating. It might be wise if the judges, instead of looking down at their decisions, started looking up, because Moses, the lawgiver, is right above their heads. In the Capitol building, if you visited the rotunda has 4 huge paintings, very prominent, of a prayer service, a baptism, and 2 Bible studies. The prayer of Christopher Columbus as he arrived on that shore is one of the paintings. The baptism of Pocahontas. The prayer and Bible study of the Pilgrims in 2 other reliefs are there, prominently displayed in the rotunda. In the Cox Corridor is the inscription, "America, God shed his grace on thee." On the East Senate entrance are the words, "Annuit Captus," which is Latin for "God has favored our undertakings." Around the House chamber are 23 carvings of historical lawgivers, but directly above the chair of the Speaker of the House is the only full face of one of them, and guess who it is? Moses, the lawgiver, right above where Speaker John Boehner stands and presides for the Senate. In the National Archives, in the floor in bronze are the 10 Commandments. In the Library of Congress, a bronze statue of Moses is in the main reading room, as well as a prominent display of the Gutenberg Bible and the Bible of Man's. As well as on the walls are etched Bible verses such as John chapter 1 and verse 5, Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 7, Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. What does the Lord require of thee? But to do justice, to walk humbly before thy God. Psalms chapter 19 and verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. The Lincoln Memorial, which was so prominent if you watched some of the fireworks displays and things yesterday in our nation's capital. In Lincoln's own words, we here are highly resolved that this nation under God shall not perish from the earth. And if you walk around the memorial, there are numerous other Bible passages that are quoted on the walls. On August 28th in 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech from the base of the Lincoln Memorial, that speech was based on Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 4 and 5, where the prophet talked about the mountains being laid low and every place being made level and being made straight. The Jefferson Memorial, which is just over on the right-hand side of the Lincoln Memorial. 5 areas inside have God-centered carvings, and including his own words, and I think these words are almost prophetic. God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are a gift from God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and His justice cannot sleep forever. In the Washington Monument, which is the tallest structure in Washington, D.C., if you went up the steps rather than taking the elevator, there are over 200 plaques that are carved and donated by the states as you go up those steps. Many of them have on them scripture verses and Bible quotations. But one of the interesting things that you really cannot see, because you cannot get up to it, is the metal capstone that is on the top of the memorial. They have a small replica of it inside, but what the National Park Service has done, they have turned the inscription toward the wall where you cannot read it. And by law, there is no building that can be higher built and taller in Washington, D.C. than the Washington Monument. And you know what is carved, that Latin phrase on that capstone? Laus Deo, God be praised. When we look at our founding fathers, one of the questions is, were our founding fathers really religious at all? Well, it's obvious from when we look at some of the quotes around Washington, D.C., and it was George Washington and others that had the Capitol built and the inscriptions that are there. I think we can tell their intentions. But George Washington, not only in his opening statement, made at the Constitutional Convention of 1887 or 1787, but in his personal diary, in his own handwriting, he says this: "Let my heart, gracious God, be so affected with your glory and majesty that I am discharged of these weighty duties which thou requirest of me. Again, I have called on thee for pardon and forgiveness of sins, for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ offered on the cross for me. Thou gavest thy Son to die for me, and has given me the assurance of my salvation." Sort of sounds to me that George Washington was a little bit religious, don't you think? Samuel Adams, who is considered the father of the American Revolution, declared at the writing of the Declaration of Independence, quote, "We have this day restored the sovereign to whom all men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven, and from the rising to the setting of the sun, let his kingdom come." John Jay, anyone know who John Jay is? He was the first justice of the Supreme Court. He has been called the father of the Supreme Court. John Jay writes in a letter to John Murray, "Divine providence," that's God, "has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." Isn't that interesting? Our philosophy today, you can't mix religion and politics. You can't have people that are spiritual in office. Well, John Jay thought we could. In fact, he said those are the kind of people we ought to elect. When we look at the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, the preamble of the Declaration of Independence says what? We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, in whom are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When we look at the Constitution, one of the interesting things about the Constitution is that over a 10-year period, political science professors at the University of Houston collected over 15,000 writings and documents by the Founding Fathers. And the goal was to find out what was the primary source of ideas behind the writing of the Constitution by identifying the sources most quoted by them. Guess what their primary source was? The Bible. 94% of the quotes of the founders of our nation were based upon the Bible. Isn't that lucky? And therefore, when we begin to look at the documents that are being written by our forefathers and the things that they did for us, we recognize that they were dependent upon God for the survival of our nation. Congressional law was passed in 1792 that approved the use of Bibles in our schools and even paid for them with tax dollars. In 1844, when someone sued to remove them from our schools, the Supreme Court ruled this: why should not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in our schools? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly and so perfectly as from the New Testament? And they dismissed the case. When we look at the founding of our colleges and our universities, we recognize that the first 10 universities in our country were established by the colonialists. We just have time to rush through this right quick. But notice each one of these. And the first four, Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, and Princeton universities, were all founded as theological seminaries. We'd call them schools of preaching. Most of these, as you look at them, are in the Ivy League: Princeton, Columbia, Brown University, Rutgers, Dartmouth. The exception on there is the University of Pennsylvania. But notice they were founded by each of these colonies: Massachusetts Bay, the colony of Virginia; Connecticut colony; Province of New Jersey; Province of New York; Province of Pennsylvania; colony of Rhode Island; Province of New Jersey; and Province of New Hampshire. And they were all founded, and their primary religious influence was Puritan, Church of England, Congregational, Presbyterian, Church of England, Baptist, Dutch Reformed, and Puritan. And therefore, when we look at the founding of our universities, and I think the founders of those universities would be spinning in their graves if they looked at some of the things that are now being taught in the schools that they founded, because they founded them for different purposes than what is now being taught in many of those universities. Many of them are fine universities, receive a secular education. But the point I want to make is these universities, the first four of them, were founded for seminary, for training preachers. What do preachers do? They preach about God. They're founded by churches. And therefore, even our colleges and our universities are those things that are founded by God. And you know, when we think about what God has done for us and given to us, not only the founding of our universities and our colleges, but I think we need to realize that America has changed. I want to go back to a Bible passage in the book of 2 Chronicles in chapter 26, and I want to look at the first 6 verses. It's the story about Uzziah. Uzziah was the king of Israel, and I want us to notice especially in verse 6. But all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. Now, Amaziah was a righteous man, but his heart was not totally toward God, but God considered him righteous. So for many years of his life, Uzziah did have a righteous example, and generations of faithfulness that come up are always encouraging to us. And it talks about the things that he did. He built Elu and restored Judah, and the king slept with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old. That's awful young to be a ruler of a country when he became king, but he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He continued to seek the Lord in the days of Zechariah, who had visions of understanding of God, and as long as he sought God, God prospered him. I think that's the principle. As long as God is being sought, God will prosper. You see, he had a great influence of not only Zechariah, but Isaiah the prophet was also there with him. And because of his faith, now later on in the chapter we find that he did have a moment in time in where he did have a folly. He was lifted up with pride, but God warned him by leprosy breaking out on his forehead, and he left the temple and he was confined to his own house. But he was considered faithful to God, and we're going to look at some of those questions in our life group tonight about his life. But Uzziah had the second longest reign in Israel's history, 52 years. And the key to his success and the key to the nation succeeding is because he was faithful to God and God prospered him. What is it? We're so independent in our country. What is it that our independence has cost us? And I think there are 4 things that I want us to look at of what our independence and what our freedom has cost us as individuals. First of all, there's a feeling among so many people of independence from rules and law. How many times daily do you count people that you're trying to drive the speed limit and all of a sudden, whew, they're down there? And what do we always say? Where's the cop when you need one? And sometimes there'll be one down the road and you sort of go by and you wave, you know. But how many people feel so independent? I mean, individuals and parents and teachers and kids who think they're an exception to the rule. My dad said, I don't have to do that. My parents say, I don't have to do that. How many times have you driven up frustrated into a parking lot and you see somebody that's parked in a handicap zone that's not handicapped? Oh, I'm just running in there for 5 minutes. I didn't pay the parking meter because I'm just running in there for 5 minutes. There's so many people that think they're an exception to the rule, that it's for everybody else. I like the bumper sticker when we lived in the Bay Area in the late 60s and early 70s. At that time, San Francisco, of course, was sort of rife with demonstrators and people like this, and cops were known as pigs, and everybody was sort of down on the establishment. But I like the bumper sticker that I saw said, next time you're in trouble, try calling a hippie. You know, we badmouth our policemen or our firemen or somebody else, but when we need help, who do we call? The establishment. And therefore, the idea of independence, sometimes we feel so independent. You know, we really don't need anybody else. I'm the exception to the rule. Yeah, they have to obey the law, but I don't have to obey. That idea of independence sort of is, I can kind of do my own thing and I'm not responsible to anybody else. But I think, secondly, it has caused us an independence from our society and from our neighborhoods. You know, our privacy is killing us. If you go down and look architecturally and you go down Wood Avenue or go down Walnut Street and you look at those old homes and you look at the modern house today, you notice what architectural feature is missing? The front porch. Because we used to sit on the front porch. We used to know our neighbor. Kids used to play on the street. And you know, you didn't get away with anything. Because if Mama didn't know about it, Miss Jones next door knew about it, and she's telephoning Mom and saying, guess what Johnny just did? We were responsible for each other. We took care of each other. And a lot of times in smaller cities, you didn't lock your front door because somebody may need to come visit and spend the night. Or your neighbor might need something out of the refrigerator. And so you didn't have to lock your door. But you know, since the invention of television and air conditioning, we've closed ourselves in, we've shut our door, we put no solicitor signs by our doorbell, we have garage door closers, and we don't know who our neighbor is. And we don't visit anymore. We have shut ourselves off from society. And you know, our privacy is killing us. We're so sad the last couple of weeks with the shootings in South Carolina and the problems in Baltimore. But you know, the government was responsible for Baltimore and for Chicago and for New York in this way. And that is, in 1965, during Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, we decided we were going to take the poor and the disenfranchised, and we're going to build these huge government buildings, and we're going to put them over there by themselves, and they're out of our neighborhoods. They're not our responsibility anymore, and so they're over there. And for the last 50 years, we've had our neighbors and others over there that are poor, locked up in those government buildings. And they're full of drugs and crime and everything else, when they used to be part of our neighborhood. The government is responsible for Baltimore and Chicago and those areas. And every time we try to do something about it and throw money at it, it just gets worse and worse and worse. Because we've sort of said, well, now that's not our problem anymore. They're not in our neighborhood. They're over there. And it becomes us against them. That's what's happened to our society and our neighborhood. You see, our privacy is really killing us. We can't get information about anybody anymore. We can't find out if we want to hire somebody what their background is. We can't find out anymore about school conduct or medical information. Do you know that if your child is 18 and gone to college, you cannot call the college and find out what their grades are? And you're paying for it. That is now part of the Privacy Act. That information cannot be released. Our privacy is killing us because we've become the age of not the society and what does society need and what do our neighbors need and what do others need. It's all about me. I still like what Spock said at the end of the Wrath of Khan when he was dying in the radiation chamber. And Kirk asked him, why did you do it? And he said this, because the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. And you know, aren't you thankful that's what Jesus had in his philosophy? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. And if we could ever get back to a country and a society and an idea where the needs of many outweigh my needs, we can change the country, we can change the church, but we need to change ourselves. And therefore, when we look at that, independence oftentimes from spouse and family, and Jerry and Lynn Jones mentioned this in their seminar a couple of months ago, because you see, many marriages aren't we. It's me, it's my money, it's my things. It's my right to go hunting or fishing or golfing or shopping every weekend. And therefore, some people just sort of live in the home, but it's not we. We're really not married. And I appreciate the last generation especially of Christian men that have stepped up to the plate to make marriage work, to realize that whatever it takes, whatever the role is, we have more men today that are changing diapers and doing dishes and vacuuming and all of these things. And sometimes economically they're even stay-at-home dads because they realize if this marriage is going to work because of our economics, both husband and wife have to work, whatever I have to do to make this home work, I'm going to make it work. And I'm thankful for those men and women that step up to the plate and do what needs to be done. But sometimes our independence is killing us. And in independence from God, fewer Americans claim to be Christians than any time in the last century. And the growing number of millennials that are leaving the church is staggering. Because many are saying, well, I want Jesus but not the church. But that statement is also declaring, you see, I can do Christianity on my own. I don't need you. I don't need your support. I don't need your help. I'm going to create my own theology. I'm going to do all of this by myself because after all, you know, the Old Testament especially, is pretty irrelevant. That was for them there because things today are just kind of relative and there's no absolutes. And our independence from God is killing our nation. In killing us. And when you look at the rise and decline of God in America, we realize that there have been ups and downs. But you know, the founding fathers of colonial America in 1620, the Mayflower group signed a compact on the ship proclaiming that they had come to the New World for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. In the early colonies, the first buildings to be erected was a church building. When sorrow came, they gathered at church. When Thanksgiving and crops were bountiful, they gathered to give thanks at church. In 1643, as more and more people came and formed the New England Confederation and wrote the first Constitution in the New World, it began with these words, whereas we all came into these parts with one and the same aim, namely, to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel in purity and peace. And I think it would be naive to think that everybody that came to this country had religious reasons or religious background or religious purposes. There have been declines of spirituality in our nation. The import of slaves, the import of indentured servants, which King George did to this country, the land interest of the crown brought many slaves, brought many non-religious people into the colonies, and so there began to be a decline in America. By 1730, there were fewer than 10% of the colonials that attended church. But in 1734, there was a great awakening when Jonathan Edwards preached his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And other evangelists began to follow. George Whitefield, John Wesley, and others. And thousands of people came to Christ and were baptized so that churches couldn't hold crowds and open-air meetings had to be held. And so there began to be a religious upsurge. And it's interesting that Benjamin Franklin noted and said it was wonderful to see the change made in the manners of our inhabitants. Being from thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in the evening without hearing psalms sung in different families from every street. In fact, Franklin was so impressed with the preaching of George Whitefield that he helped build an auditorium to accommodate crowds of 30,000 people who came to hear Whitefield preach. And by the way, Philadelphia at that time only had a population of 25,000. And so people were coming everywhere to hear preachers preach. And it was not just in Philadelphia, but in all the 13 colonies. Open-air devout Christians were no longer at 10%, but over 50% of the population of our country was again Christian. And therefore, when you think about things that began to happen in our country. But Western expansionism, growth again, another low in religion and worship from about 1790 to 1822. And then the Second Great Awakening is called Cane Ridge in 1822. Really began also the start of our Restoration movement and other movements throughout that lasted about 1860. And then we know what happened in 1861. The Civil War basically tore our nation apart in its aftermath. And from 1860 to 1890, there was again a low period of spirituality in the United States. But then from 1890 to 1920, some of the great preachers of America and crowds by the thousands would again fill the churches in New York and Boston and Philadelphia and other places to hear men preach. And then from 1920 to 1950, the Great Depression, World War I and World War II brought about a decline in religion. But after the war, and men began to come home and things began to happen, from 1950 to about 1980 is what we call the church growth era. In fact, in 1965, it was noted in Time magazine that the Churches of Christ were the fastest growing religious group in America. We had 2,500,000 members. Don't let that go to your head. But from 1980 to now, we're in what we might call the post-Christian era, in which fewer people are attending church and fewer people are even claiming to be religious. And that's the highest majority it has been since the time that this country was founded. But I want to close by looking at the challenge that faces us as the church and answer the question, can America be revived? And it's going to be up to us as Christians and up to the church to be able to do it. And I think Jesus gives us an answer when we look at Matthew chapter 6, and we know, of course, from the Sermon on the Mount, he begins to talk about the kind of life the disciples need to live versus what others live. He acknowledged that we live in a fallen world because he ends by saying in verse 34, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Each day has enough trouble for itself. We recognize that, but you see, there's a great difference between being legitimately concerned about something and needless worry. In fact, psychologists tell us that 80% of the things we worry about never come to pass. And so why do we worry about them? We've got troubles as Christians. We've got concerns. We've got struggles like everybody else. But you see, Jesus gives us reasons not to have to worry about those kind of things. He says, is life not more? You see, the greatest thing that God gave us was life. And therefore, when we look at the difference between the greatest gift, if God can supply life, can He not also supply the lesser things, like food and clothing and a place to live? And is not life itself more important than the building or the bread or everything else? You know, other people worry about that. The Gentiles worry about that. What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? What am I going to do? You see, if we're really focused on God and trust in God, God's going to supply those kind of things. And therefore, why do we worry about that? You see, He gives an example of nature. If God takes care of nature, won't He take care of you, His highest creation? So don't sweat the small stuff. Live a life that is worry-free. And in doing that, we need to realize our spiritual worth to God. You see, we need to realize that God wants to take care of us. Jesus says that life is more important than things. God blessing you and taking care of you, He's used to doing that, and you're worth more than nature. And therefore, because Jesus died for people, He died for you and for me, and you're worth something to Him. Your soul is worth more than the whole world. And therefore, don't worry about those kind of things. Jesus takes care of that. Realize that you're important. I know we talk a lot today about self-esteem. Maybe in the church we need to change that to soul esteem. You see, God's concerned about our soul. God loves us. Jesus died for us. And therefore, we're very, very valuable to Him. And realize our spiritual worth. I think also we need a God-centered faith. In the movie Prince Caspian, C.S. Lewis, in writing his trilogy, the child Lucy encounters Aslan, the Christ-like figured lion, in the Narnia stories. And when she hasn't seen him for a long time and discovers him, she says, "Aslan, you're bigger." And he answers by saying, "That is because you're older, little one. Not because you are. I am not. But every year you grow, you will find me bigger." You know, that ought to be the way in our life, in our Christian faith. How big is God to you? The more that we grow, the more we mature spiritually, the more we depend upon God and develop, the bigger God is going to be for us. And when we depend upon God and have a God-centered faith, that God is competent to take care of everything that we need, He will supply us, as Paul said in Philippians, our every need, that if God is that big in our life, it's not because God has grown, but it's because we have grown. We're conforming ourselves to the likeness of Christ. We need to also live one day at a time, and that is live for today. Because if we spend time in the past, we can't recover it. If we spend time in the future, it's not here yet and not guaranteed. And we miss the opportunities and blessings of today. Therefore, live for today and the opportunities God will give us today to glorify Him and to do His will. And we need, therefore, to be steadfast in our faith and in our hope and in our love. Circumstances change, but God doesn't. We need to continue to demonstrate our faith and our dependence on God. Don't quit your faith. Don't quit your worship time. Don't quit your prayer life. Don't quit your family. Don't quit your opportunities to glorify God. Others might. Don't you. Don't we. Let's continue to be faithful to God, steadfast in our hope and in our love, and let God take care of the future. You see, we're in the hands of God, and God takes care of us. And therefore, we need to be totally dependent upon God. As we sing the invitation song this morning, don't live your life independent from God. You need Him for this life, and you need Him for the life to come. And if there's some response that you need to make to Him this morning, we're going to encourage you to come as together we stand and as we sing.